Hello one more time, dear guest. So by us today is Simon. He's a PhD student in business economics at Harvard, HBS in economics. So he works in public economics and industrial organization, focusing on the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. So policy design and empirical methods. Recent work studies how tax rules shape giving by top donors using new data on US family foundations alongside projects in auctions and market design. Simon, really nice to meet you. I hope I didn't miss anything out in the introduction. All right. So today's agenda will be pretty interesting. So what we will do, we'll have three parts. So in the first part, we'll ask you some personal and work-related questions to get to know you and your life and your works better. In the second part, we will specifically focus on one of your research works, which will be Pulp Fiction, the value of quantity contracts in decentralized markets. And in the third part, we'll focus on other one of your research works, which will be tax elasticities of top donors, evidence from family foundations. So basically it. One more time, thanks a lot for your time and for your contribution. We do appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Yes. So I guess we may jump right into the part one. So Simon, my first question would be pretty general. So what first drew you to the field of economics? Was there some open eyes moment that made you realize that this is what you want to be doing for the rest of your life?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what really made me fall in love with economics was um, when I took my first economics course as an undergraduate. I learned about how economists model social situations, formally model social situations. So I've always been very interested in public policy, and I've also been very interested in um, mathematics and statistics and data science. And economics really represents a marriage of those two. And so it's really exciting to think about addressing very complex, challenging, and important social problems using the tools of formal modeling, which is critical for clarifying your thinking, as well as tools from data analysis and econometrics.
Thanks a lot. Pretty insightful.
Thank you so much. So Simon, my next question would be, so you study nonprofits, and your recent paper was also about that. So as we know, like nonprofits tend to often optimize for total raised kind of. So what are some of the metrics that you wish boards and donors track that would actually improve impact of nonprofits?
Yeah, that's a really good question because sort of the motivation for the existence of the nonprofit sector, one of the motivations is that it's really difficult to know the quality or the impact or the performance of nonprofits. And so this is why we've sort of provided these sort of tax protected status for nonprofit organizations, with the idea being that because they're nonprofit maximizing, there won't be that incentive for malfeasance. That's the hope, at least. The challenge there is that donors need to have some sense of what nonprofits are performing well. And like your question hinted at, most of the readily available metrics do not provide a very good sense of nonprofit performance. So for example, let me give you a concrete example. There's a long history of donors relying on so-called overhead rates to determine their giving. So for example, what share of a nonprofit's expenditure goes to administration. But this is a really poor measure of nonprofit performance, because for a nonprofit to do well, to be effective, it needs to pay its staff well, it needs to pay its CEO well. All of this is going to show up as overhead, and so it doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of that nonprofit's efficacy. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, which has been advocated by organizations such as GiveWell, is to rely on really high quality randomized control trial evidence. Run an RCT, run an experiment, evaluate the cost effectiveness performance of the programs in a sort of causal sense. That's great in theory, but it's really difficult to run an RCT. It's really expensive to run an RCT. That's not a scalable solution. So what I would advocate for is something kind of in the middle. Donors should rely on their personal knowledge of organizations based on their, say, experience with the organization, experience in the community based on their understanding of local need, as well as whatever metrics the organization can provide, such as the number of people that they're able to serve and things like this, to get some sense of if the organization is performing well. So it's a really challenging question for exactly this reason. You don't want to rely on metrics like overhead rates, and you also can't rely on RCTs to evaluate performance. So it's a challenging question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
So my next question would be kind of personal. So Simon, what like you studied at Harvard? So what do you specifically like at Harvard, and what does it provide that is so special about it? And one more follow up here: what are your plans for your future career, and where do you plan to implement all of that knowledge in economics of yours?
Yeah, well, I guess before I talk about the specifics of being a PhD student in economics at Harvard, just in general, being a PhD student is a really wonderful experience because there's very few jobs for people at this stage of their careers where they're able to study in great depth, whatever whatever most excites you, and to have that freedom is a really unique aspect of doing a PhD. And at Harvard specifically, there's so many great resources. I would, especially think of my advisors and my professors. It's amazing to be able to develop my ideas in conversation with them, and that's been an incredible learning experience. And then in terms of my postgraduate plans, I'm planning to apply for academic positions, and we'll see what happens.
So you plan to be a professor at university, right?
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. So my next question would be, how do you decide which ideas to chase and which to drop? So what is your approach to finding right research questions? Do you have a personal rule of thumb when picking topics?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I'm as a beginner, I'm also trying to figure out myself. I would say that one way of thinking about it is that for any project, you can think about two dimensions that characterize it. The first is how sort of credible the strategy is, so sort of how rigorous, what kind of evidence can you provide? And then the second is how sort of interesting and novel and important is the research question. So, for example, if you're really interested in some, headline topic that has not really been studied before, it's really economically interesting, but you can't run, for example, a randomized controlled trial, then that sort of puts you somewhere in this space. Or in contrast, maybe you have a really innovative way of answering a question that people have been thinking about for a while. So that puts you somewhere else in this space. And what you can do is you can draw a sort of production possibilities frontier in these two dimensions, and maybe there's other dimensions. And the key is that you want to be on that frontier. You don't want to be on the interior of the space. You don't want to use methods that aren't that exciting to answer questions that also aren't that exciting. You want to sort of be on that frontier. And so for me, I kind of start, or at least in the projects that I am developing, I sort of start by reading the news, start by talking to people, understanding the world, and figuring out where those gaps are in the literature, and figure out if I'm able to answer those questions in a credible way. And then usually the way it goes is like I'll think of some question, I'll sketch out the steps that would be required to answer that question, and I'll figure out what is the one or two steps here that are sort of the fail points of this project, which are absolutely necessary for this project to succeed, and then I'll figure what are the fail points of the project, and then trying to kill the project quickly is the name of the game. And let me just give you some insight into what it's like being a PhD student. So I'm in my fourth year of the PhD. In my third year, I have maybe half a dozen different projects and I've killed all but one of them that I'm still working on. So that's just kind of how it goes. You just have to shoot a lot of shots, figure out why your projects fail, and then keep persisting and have that self confidence to keep going.
Yeah, got it. Thank you so much for sharing. And the reason I asked, because oftentimes I think that PhD students get discouraged and have a sense that everything has been discovered already. Yeah, and I think your approach to try to find a niche and a gap in something is very useful. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, and I think the key really is to not to start from the literature, but to start from the world. Start from the news, from talking to people, lived experience. And that's generally a much more fruitful area, I found, for a newcomer than reading some paper from 10 years ago. And then you see, in the conclusion, they say, there's this avenue for future research. I think it's much more exciting to start with reading the news and figuring out, oh wow, no one's really talking about this topic. I think there needs to be a lot more to learn here.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
So my question would be next. So our audience mainly consists of high schoolers and undergraduate listeners. So they want to do some impactful economics early on. And if you had to suggest or design some self-training plan or for younger researcher, what skills should they develop, what readings, what they should read, or what mini projects they should do, which maybe you could have done in the past and now regret that you didn't, and that would be great. So what would it include and why? What this list would include and why?
That's a great question. The first thing I would say is that there's an incredible amount of learning by doing. So if you want experience or you want to learn how to do something, in my experience, it's been much more effective to just try and do it, figure out what the roadblocks are along the way, and then learn as you go, than to start from a textbook thing. That's not to say that the textbook angle isn't important, but there are formal pathways of learning that textbook material through your coursework. And so doing these kind of side projects, I think, is kind of complementary to the textbook kind of learning. So that would be one answer would be just try to start a project, have a question, think about how to answer it, and then try to answer it and put something out into the world. And you'll learn a lot in the process of doing that. The other thing is reading the literature. I think is a difficult thing to do, especially some of the more contemporary literature can be a little bit technical. So it can be a little bit daunting to start by reading the literature. But I don't know, reading some of the economic history, some of the foundational work, or also reading books that aren't necessarily intended for an academic audience, I've found to be very useful. But yeah, I think my top answer would be to just do it and then see what roadblocks come up. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, sure, definitely. Thank you so much. And my next question would be a little bit creative and personal. So let's imagine if you hadn't become an economist, and what career path do you think you could have taken potentially?
That's a challenging question, because I do think I'm very well suited for this career path. I mean, I used to say that I would, economics is all about constrained optimization, and physics or computer science are also dealing with constrained optimization. But I don't think that's quite right, because I think what really excites me about economics is the connection to social problems, difficult problems that have bearing on the economy. And so I don't think that's a great answer. And I also don't think, other professional careers would be a good fit either. So I think probably my second best would be some other field like computer science or physics, but I don't think that would fully satisfy me.
Got it. Thank you for sharing.
So thanks a lot. Pretty insightful. So my next question would be the last one, I guess, for the part one. So looking forward, Simon, what big questions in economics truly excite you the most and keep you curious?
I'm really interested in the question of how, like, sort of what's going on in the guts of providing social services and public goods. How, there's all sorts of frictions when we're trying to do, do good things, satisfies people's needs, and there's all sorts of really important design questions there of how should we know there's an extraordinary amount of wealth inequality. What's the right way to redistribute those resources? Should it be through the tax and transfer system? Should it be through the nonprofit and private philanthropic setting? And then if it is through the tax and transfer system, what's the right way or what's the most efficient way to do that redistribution? I think there's a lot of interesting questions there about sort of, what are the main frictions that prevent redistribution from happening efficiently or effectively and quickly. And so that speaks to a lot of design questions that I'm really interested in.
Thanks a lot. So Simon, it was the end of part one. Now we can really move to the part two, and it will be also interesting, I guess. So we will discuss the Pulp Friction, the value of quantity contracts in decentralized markets work. And first, I would love to briefly present the paper for the audience in simple terms, and then we will go to the questions. All right. So in pulp and paper, most deals aren't one-off spot trades. So more than 80% of volume is sold under quantity contracts. So the buyer and seller lock in how much they will ship over a certain period of time, usually it's a year, while the price is still negotiated month to month. And why do this? So there are two simple reasons. First, it locks in your best partners. So you don't have to refine each other in a messy spot market every month. And second, it keeps volumes steady when prices bounce around and production can't adjust quickly. In the Also, it must be added that using invoice level data from 2014 and 2019 and an empirical model, the authors of this paper show a typical contract is worth about 57 euros per ton, which is around 10% of net price. And if you remove the steady volumes benefit, the value drops by roughly 25%, which is a lot. And if you remove the rigidity of cost of being pre-committed, the value would be 84% higher. So the big picture here, in conclusion, would be that quantity contracts are a practical fix for surge and bargaining frictions. When those frictions shrink, you would expect fewer contracts. So I hope I didn't miss anything out.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks. So we can move to the questions now. So Simon, what first motivated you to study quantity contracts in the pulp market? So was it like a real world model moment, or maybe a gap in the literature that you found and you couldn't ignore?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been a while since we started at a big sort of pulp manufacturer, and pulp is the most important input to paper production. So it's kind of, you can think of it kind of like a white mush, which, you know, economists love to think about products that are basically white mush because that, you know, that's sort of the canonical product where you would expect to see some sort of competitive landscape, and that's not at all what we see in the wood pulp industry. And I think that was really the puzzle that motivated us, was we have this product which for all intents and purposes is completely homogenous, but why don't we have, you know, some kind of centralized auction mechanism that's allocating this product to buyers? Instead, we have this somewhat decentralized, convoluted system that's based around these long-term contracts that seem to prevent a lot of potentially high-value deals from being made. So we really started with that puzzle, and we learned about these institutional details from talking to people at the firm. And when we saw this puzzle, which was like a discrepancy between what the basic economic theory would predict and what we see in reality, the natural question is like, why? What's going on here? And so again, we interviewed a bunch of people and we looked at the data, and what we learned was that if they tried to do things on a month-to-month basis instead of on an annual basis, they would just run into a bunch of logistical frictions. It's really challenging to figure out who you're going to be able to trade tons and tons of this product with, especially given the sort of transportation logistics that have to happen in the middle. It's a lot easier to just sort of figure that out once at an annual level, put a bunch of quantity through those long-term annual contracts, and then maybe you do a little bit of side spot transactions throughout the year, but the core of the business model is really about these annual long-term contracts. So it really comes down to this we call it a search friction, but we're very broad about what that interpretation is. And what's really going on is if you try to do all this trade at a short-term, high-frequency spot market, it would just be logistically a nightmare, and you wouldn't find those profitable opportunities.
Got it. So Simon, could you please walk us through a typical deal timeline in this market? So what's fixed for the year? What's renegotiated monthly, and why?
Yeah. So the way it typically works for an annual contract is sometime around November, the buyer and seller will have a meeting, and they'll write up a contract that says each month over the next year, I would like to trade, say, 3,000 tons of pulp with you. It's not going to specify precisely how many tons of pulp that have to be traded in any given month. There's a little bit of flexibility there. So you can think about these annual contracts as being a sort of rule of thumb that sets the terms of the relationship over the year to come. Then during the year, what they do is they specify in this annual contract a fixed rebate off of a market price. So for example, the contract might say that the price will be, say, the market price minus 5%, or the market price minus 6%. And then during the year, the price will be pinned down by market price minus 5 or minus 6%. Now, some contracts don't even say that. They just say, we'll just figure out the price later. But so there, the key part of the contract is the sort of quantity soft commitment, which says that the buyer is agreeing to purchase around 3,000 tons of pulp per year. So this kind of clues us in to what's going on is really most relevant to the quantity dimension of things as opposed to the price dimension.
Got it. Sure. So, if you were advising a seller today, what simple rule of thumb would you use to decide how much to contract versus leave us at spot in percentages, if possible?
Right. Well, I guess I would just say that in the industry, it's typically 85 to 90% contracted, and then 10 to 15% spot. And so I think a key question here is just the scale of the operation. So, for example, there are some buyers. So let's think about it from the buyer perspective first. There are some buyers that are pretty small purchasers, and they don't sign these annual contracts. They instead will just trade on the spot, and that's because for them, they're able to find these deals without having to worry about all of the logistics. Because they're small, they can do that. If they were too big, then it wouldn't be feasible for them to do this. And in fact, what a lot of small buyers will do is they'll go through an intermediary, which will help match them with sellers. So I think that's a very attractive option for buyers who are a bit smaller and don't need to lock away so much quantity through these annual contracts. Now, on the seller side, it's a bit different because sellers are pretty much universally very, very large. And so all of them are going to be trading with a substantial fraction of these annual quantity contracts. Now, whether it's 85%, 90%, 50% will depend on those logistical challenges that the seller runs into when it's trying to come up with these monthly transactions. So if the seller is able to find a bunch of profitable opportunities on the month-to-month level, then it makes sense for it to use fewer quantity contracts. Now, one thing I would say, your question was sort of normative in the sense that you asked sort of what should the seller do. This paper is very much a positive paper in the sense that it's just trying to understand what sellers do and why they do it. So, the main forces that determine what level of quantity contracting a seller implements are going to be those logistical frictions that we were just talking about. So how challenging is it to find those spot buyers from month to month? And B will be how many lost opportunities are there if you don't find these spot buyers? So this will be, for example, are there a bunch of really high willingness to pay buyers out there that you're not able to trade with because you've already contracted away a larger quantity? So the answer will come down to a balance between those two forces. Of, on one hand, the logistical frictions, and on the other hand, the lost opportunities.
Got it. So my last question for the part two would be, what's the next research question this paper opened up for you, either in pulp or in other input markets with similar contracts?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I think the sort of big picture motivation for this paper is that in real world supply chain, there are any number of frictions that prevent us from, using what the sort of the auction model or the perfectly competitive model or the, sort of efficient benchmark, whatever you want to call it. There are any number of frictions. And I think the main point of this paper is that there's many ways that buyers and sellers can structure their trade in response to these frictions to try and minimize these frictions. So let me give you another example outside of quantity contracts. That would be intermediation, which is one of the main literatures that this paper relates to. So in the face of these similar logistical frictions, what a lot of markets do is they use intermediation as a market structure to mitigate the costs of these search frictions. And the point of this paper is intermediation also comes with costs. This is known in the literature. I mean, if you add in an intermediary, they're taking some share of the surplus generated from trade. And so it might not work for all settings, especially settings where you have really big buyers and sellers, like in the pulp industry. So the question I'm really left with is, okay, well, you find in the pulp industry that quantity contracts are the way that buyers and sellers organize trade to mitigate the costs of these search frictions. What are some of the other ways of organizing trade that we might see in other industries? When does it make sense to do intermediation? When does it make sense to do quantity contracting? And is there some third thing that is still still unexplored. So I think there's lots of interesting questions there. I'm thinking about when we move from these textbook models of markets to reality, how do buyers and sellers structure trade in a way that mitigates the costs of some of these frictions?
Thanks a lot, Simon. Got it. So it's all by me. We can move to the part three.
Sounds great.
Sure. Thank you so much. Really learned a lot of insights. But I'd also like to talk about your different paper, which we mentioned is about tax elasticities of top donors, evidence from family foundations, which is the paper found really exciting. So I could briefly introduce it to the audience, and then we could proceed to the questions. So this paper basically asks how very rich donors who give through family foundations react to tax rules. Here, I mean, family foundation is a private foundation funded and often run by one family, and which follows often special IRS rules. One key rule is the 5% payout rule, which says a private foundation must give out about 5% of its assets each year or face penalties. So here Simon and studies two levers. First is the tax subsidy that encourages donors to put money into their foundation. And the second is the penalty, which is tied to the 5% payout rule. Simon also builds a new dataset from foundation tax filings to measure how giving changes over time. So here the main results show that a 1% bigger tax subsidy raises contributions into the foundations by about 0.67% in present value, but it also raises actual payouts to charities by only 0.37%. Additionally, making the payout requirement tighter by 1 percentage point increases payouts by about 0.33%, which is mostly by drawing from foundation assets. And I would say that this means policy choices can affect how much money reaches working charities now and versus later. Yes, I think I didn't miss any point. Please fix me. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that was great.
Sure. So my first question would be, what gap in the evidence made you want to study like top donors and family foundations specifically?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So this goes back to our earlier conversation about how I come up with research ideas, and this one was really reading the news. So I just kept seeing these headline articles about really big foundations. What were they doing? Um, what are some of the controversies around them? And when I looked in the literature on charitable giving, I realized that a lot of it focuses on small donors. And the reason is because methodologically, a lot of this literature uses lab or field experiments. And obviously, if you're doing a lab or a field experiment, you're not going to be able to study some of these top donors, some of these really high net worth donors. And so I thought that this was a gap in the literature, especially because in the United States, there's been some really interesting trends in the donor base. So for one, the percent of households that are giving to charity has fallen from 66% in 2000 to 50% in 2018. So fewer households are giving to charity, and those that do are giving increasing amounts. So I think the top 1% share of charitable giving is like 40%. So 40% of all charitable giving comes from the top 1% of households. And I thought that it's really important that we separately study this set of donors, especially because it's likely that they react to tax incentives differently. In the US, we provide incredibly generous tax subsidies for charitable giving, and these subsidies are very regressive. So most of them accrue to these top 1% donors because of how the subsidy is designed. So it really begs the question of how do these donors respond to tax subsidies? How does it change their giving? How does it change the resources that go to charity? And how does it change the resources that go to the Department of the Treasury? How does it change public resources? And we have to know those two things if we want to sort of trade off basically the revenue effects of some subsidy change from the potential externality of increasing charitable giving. And that's really the key question of the design of the subsidy, which is what I'm really interested in. And we have reason to think that these donors are going to respond to their tax incentives differently than other donors. That's really the key motivation is donors who give through a family foundation, they receive they receive a tax benefit when they make a contribution to their foundation. But they're not required to disperse all of those resources to charity at the time of the contribution. They face this 5% threshold. They have to disperse at least 5% of their assets to charity each year. But beyond that, they can really spread their giving out over many years. So they receive an immediate tax benefit for potentially delayed giving. So this has important implications when we're thinking about how to design this subsidy, especially because foundations hold, I think, $1.6 trillion in assets that are earmarked for future giving. These are all tax subsidized assets, you know? So it really is an interesting question of like, why do we have $1.6 trillion in assets tax subsidized that are not yet going to operating foundations and to operating nonprofits? And that's really the question that motivated me.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing. And my next question would be, so as I said earlier, when I was giving an overview of the paper, so you try to focus on two incentives. The tax subsidy that encourages contributions into foundation, and the second is the penalty if the foundation fails the 5% payout requirement, right? So here is the follow-up question. So why did you choose these two levers, and how do they kind of shape behavior in different ways?
So the first lever, which is the subsidy that donors get for a contribution to their foundation, this is kind of the main way in which tax policy in the United States shapes giving behavior. It's true for any donor. It's true for big donors or small donors. But we have reason to think that big donors are going to react differently to this subsidy than small donors. So let me give you one piece of policy background that could help. In the United States, you have to pay a capital gains tax on, if you liquidate your appreciated securities. But there's a way to avoid this. One way that you can avoid this is make a contribution of those appreciated securities to your foundation. So instead of giving cash to your foundation, you can give your appreciated, say, Microsoft stock. Then when you later liquidate those securities, when you're giving it to charity, giving the proceeds to charity, you don't have to pay capital gains tax. So this gives donors a very strong incentive to make a contribution to their foundation. In years, for example, where their securities are doing very well or have appreciated a lot, because they're able to avoid paying capital gains tax. And this is really a primary lever along which tax policy can shape donor behavior and ultimately the amount of resources that are going to operating nonprofits. Now, regarding the minimum payout rate, this is a policy that's really specific to foundations in the United States. It's very policy relevant. There's been a lot of debate about should it be 5% or should it be higher, should it be 10%, or should it be zero? So for some other entities, which are referred to as donor advised funds, these are basically they're sort of similar to foundations in the sense that donors can get an immediate tax benefit for a contribution to a donor advised fund, but they don't face, in this case, any requirements about how fast to disperse those resources to charity. So there's been a lot of controversy about should we put requirements on donor advised funds and require that they have to disperse 5 or 10% of their assets each year to charity. So given the policy background, that's really why I was interested in the minimum payout rate. And it's especially relevant for foundations because, like I've been emphasizing, there's this distinction between when you make a contribution to the foundation and when you actually disperse those resources to charity. So one way to think about it is that the tax subsidy really mediates that first part of the decision. So when you make the contribution to your foundation, And then the minimum payout rate means that second part. So when do you actually make that disbursement to an operating charity? So that makes it a natural parent for me to study.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. And Simon, my last question here. Uh, so you find that 1% increase in tax subsidy raises contributions by about 0.67%, right? In present value. But it also raises charitable disbursements by only about 0.37%. So why do contributions move more than actual payouts to charities? And what is that gap tell about us? What does the gap mean?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of the economics of this paper. So, like I mentioned, foundations hold $1.6 trillion in assets. And a lot of foundations aim to operate into perpetuity. They don't have sunset clauses. They have an endowment that they want to maintain. And so there's a real question of like, what is the size of this endowment? And if tax policy changes, then the size of that endowment might change as well. So what happens when we increase the subsidy is donors do respond by increasing contributions, but they also respond by increasing the size of the endowment of their foundations. There's many reasons why donors might increase the size of the endowment of their foundation. Maybe it's because it guarantees that the foundation can operate into perpetuity. Maybe it's because they like holding a big foundation. Maybe it's because giving to charity is difficult or it's costly for them. It takes time for them to make these allocations to operating nonprofits. But what I find empirically is that they do increase the size of their endowments in response to an increase in the subsidy. This means that only a fraction of the increase in contributions actually leads to increases in charitable disbursements. What this means for policy is that, like I mentioned, when we're designing policy, we have to trade off two things. On one hand, a policy could increase or decrease tax revenue, which could be used for other programs, could be used to fund, the earned income tax credit. It could be used to fund food stamps. There's any number of things that the tax revenue could be used for. And if you increase the subsidy, then you're going to reduce tax revenue. The amount that you reduce tax revenue will be proportional to that first elasticity, the 0.67, which is the change in contributions to the foundation, because the contributions are what is subsidized. So that's one side of the trade-off. The other side of the trade-off is the externality. So this is going to be the idea that charitable giving is good. We want to encourage charitable giving. And that will be that sort of second part. That's the disbursements to operating nonprofits, the 0.37 number. So when we're thinking about this trade-off between the tax revenue cost of increasing the subsidy and the externality charitable giving benefit of increasing the subsidy, it's really going to depend on the gap between those two elasticities, the 0.67 and the 0.37. To the extent that there is a gap, that's going to tell us that we want to reduce the subsidy.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I think it's pretty much it by me. We have no questions left, so
Great.
So Simon, thanks a lot one more time for your time and for your contribution. We do appreciate that. And could you please like rate the work that we did today? Like we're open to criticism. What should we add? What was bad? What was good?
No, this was great, and I really appreciate you both taking the time to look through my work and ask some really insightful questions. I thought the questions you asked were really getting to the core of the economics of these two papers, which I really appreciated. I thought they were really insightful.
thank you, Simon.
Thank you so much, Simon. So one more time, thanks a lot for your time and for your contribution.
So
we really appreciate it. Our audience will also appreciate it. So I hope we will keep in touch. Good luck in your future work, in your studies. So yes, it was a pleasure to meet you.
And to you as well.
Have a good day. Bye.
Sure.
All right.
So thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Bye.